Hi, everyone. Hi, Charles Yu. I am so thrilled to get this opportunity to talk to you. I have to just gush for a second and tell you that I am such a fan and I just truly adored this book. It's one of the most inventive things that I've ever read. It was hysterical, but also so heartfelt. And when I was asked to moderate this conversation, I jumped at the opportunity because I want to get inside that head of yours because it was just such a clever book. And it's not a particularly thick one. I read it in about 2 days, but I heard that it took you 7 years to write. Why did it take so long?
Well, hi Lisa Ling. It's really incredible to be talking to you. I can't thank you enough for agreeing to do this. And it's a good question. I don't know why it took so long. I guess life. We've got my wife and I have two kids, and I was working as a lawyer. But really, those are excuses. It took a long time because I needed to find the right way to tell the story. And even after I found this kind of strange way into the story, uh, I had to work through it for a couple of years to figure it out.
Well, and for those of you who haven't read the book, when Charles talks about this strange way, I mean, it is written um, in the form of a teleplay, of a script, which is why it's so unique. But you mentioned, Charles, that you were a lawyer. You went to law school like a good Asian boy. So,
Right.
um, when did when did becoming a writer enter your consciousness?
Well, I mean, yeah, I went to law school like a good Asian boy, but not that good because the original plan was medical school, and that didn't work out for me, and also for the world because it's a good thing I'm not a doctor. I think I think your husband is a doctor, is that right? So
He is.
doctors are
He
grown
is.
ups. I'm not a grown up exactly, so I was like, I can't imagine someone's life in my hands. It's a good thing.
Well, he's not a grown up, too much of a grown up either, but he does have a particular skill set.
So yeah, after medical school didn't work out, I went to law school thinking, well, this is a responsible thing to do, financially and sort of, uh, my parents are immigrants from Taiwan, and they came here and worked really hard. And I thought if I just go and uh, uh, pursue whatever I want to, it won't. It just didn't feel responsible at the time. So I thought law school, uh, I get to read and write. It's sort of like what I like to do, but I think somewhere in the back of my head all along, I wanted to write. I just didn't know how or when that would happen exactly.
And talk to me about some of your influences. I mean, you seem like you had that kind of that burning desire that you were probably repressing, but what was it that inspired you to want to do it?
You know, I don't know. I think from like a young age, I was writing poems. I remember like when I was in elementary school, our teacher took us to Yosemite for this trip, and he found out like during the week that I'd been writing these little poems, and I guess I was interested in writing from when I was a kid. But then I just didn't exactly know, like, is that a job? Like, how do you become a writer, or do you just do it? And then when I graduated from law school, I went to work at one of these big law firms, and I was really scared because I was like, well, I don't think I can handle this. I think they're going to figure out pretty quickly that I don't belong here, and they're going to kick me out. But there was sort of a lot of pressure in trying to uh, fit into that environment, and I think something about that made me want to carve out a little space of my own, and that just took the form of these short stories that I started to write that were. I didn't even think of them as stories first. They were like things that I would scribble in the margin of like a legal pad, or like email myself a sentence so that I wouldn't forget it. And later that night, I'd go back to it and be like, well, what is this? And, for many years, I was writing and working as a lawyer at the same time. And they were just two very separate things. but yeah, I don't know exactly what influenced. I mean, I always loved to read, and I loved um, uh, stories, and something about uh, being in control of the story has always appealed to me. And that's what you can do with writing, right? You can do it by yourself.
Well, when did you make that transition to become a full-time writer? Because I imagine, working as a lawyer, there's a certain aspect of security there. So when did you actually make that transition and sort of recognize the fact that like I can do this, like I can make a career out of this?
Yeah, it was a few years ago when I started writing full time, but it didn't happen sort of overnight. I graduated from law school about 20 years ago, and I only started writing full time like 6 years ago. So for most of the time I've been writing, I had a day job, and um, when I first published a book, it was 2006. It was a short story collection, and um, I remember how excited I was. It was thrilling to find out, oh, I'm going to have a book in the world, right? That it just is a huge milestone, and something I kind of never thought would happen. And at the same time, the realities of that, it's a debut short story collection. Uh, I was like looking at my first, installment of the advance and realizing, oh, yeah, I have to keep the day job here. I mean, and so from the beginning, I really didn't think this is something I'm going to leave the law for. It's just something that my passion, and I had to do it, and I found myself doing it, you know, uh, at late nights. I'd sneak an hour after the kids were down, or very early when, like with the baby here, just sort of like trying to think or read. And then a few years ago, I got lucky enough to I got a call. I was working as a lawyer at a tech company in LA, and I got a call at work asking if I'd come interview for a job on this HBO show, Westworld. And I thought, this can't be real, and also there's no way I'll get this job. But, I went, and they hired me for some reason. So that was really the transition. So since then, I've been writing for TV and film. And so that's my new day job, like my first love, to write fiction and just basically sit in a room by myself, sit in this room actually by myself. It's still my first love, but I also, uh, need health insurance and that sort of thing. So the Writers Guild has been very crucial to our family's well-being in that respect.
Well, I guess, in some ways, Interior Chinatown has allowed you to meld, right, a number of different things, given that it's written as a teleplay. And what I found so interesting about the book is just how the characters in it are described in some ways as a means to call up these stereotypical, almost like identityless roles that the media has projected of Asians. Generic Asian man, kung fu man. I mean, these are the titles or the names of the characters in this book. And I wonder about the kinds of images that you saw as a kid or growing up of Asian people, and the impact that your perception of Asians in Hollywood had on writing this book.
Yeah. Um, it's a great connective tissue. I think that the way you framed it is really right on. It's, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, having never seen an Asian really on TV. It'd be like a once a year occurrence. Like, oh, look, there's an Asian. um, and um, and then quickly the excitement is quickly followed by the feeling of, oh yeah, that he's delivering food, or he's speaking with an accent that sounds pretty fake, or he's doing martial arts, right? And but so that experience kind of mirrors in a lot of ways, I think, my own experience as an Asian American. There's a sense in which I'm mostly feeling invisible, the way Asian characters were invisible on screen. punctuated by brief moments of visibility that's often accompanied by a sort of self-consciousness or even shame, because it's like, oh, here's my brief window of visibility and this is what it is. It's in this very narrow slot of certain defined roles, as you said, certain things that, it's like, keep all the Asian stuff over here in this corner of things. So we'll do a very special episode that's set in Chinatown, or, um, Asian characters have to sort of present a certain way on TV and film. And I think that really sort of shaped my sort of consciousness in terms of, where do I fit into this story? Where do my parents fit into this story? And all of their generation and my friends. And now that I'm a dad, where will my kids fit into this story? Having been born here, and so I think all of that kind of was in the mix as I was writing the book.
Well, I know exactly what you're talking about. For me, I was babysat by the television because my parents were working all the time. They were divorced when I was young, but I looked nothing, or the people that I was watching on television looked nothing like me, except for Connie Chung. And at the time, she was the embodiment of intelligence and grace. And so I thought, well, if Connie Chung can do this, maybe I can do this as well. And I would venture to guess that almost every Asian journalist of my generation, I think I'm a bit older than you, would cite Connie Chung as their inspiration, because for me, she represented what was possible. Did you have anyone who represented what was possible for you, and how would you define representation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And not to throw it back at you, but it is, I think, I want to say I was either in college or just out of college when you first started turning up on The View. Is that, I want to say, like late 90s, maybe? I graduated in
Yeah.
97. So, okay.
Yeah, I started
Uh,
in about 98, 99. Yeah.
I mean, that was a big deal. It's like, oh, wow. Like, who is this person? She's on TV. She's on like a big show, in the middle of the day, where you just feel like, that was notable. I'm trying to think. I mean, I didn't. I certainly. Well, I guess I remember at Berkeley taking an Asian American Studies class. I think it was Asian American Studies 20 or something like that, and it's like this big survey class, um, and they're really being kind of exposed to some ideas and some history and some readings. Of course, I had grown up. My parents were actually active in the Taiwanese American community and had encouraged my brother and me to be part of that. Like, we'd gone to camps and things like that, and done voter registration and internships. But I think it wasn't until I sort of left the house and had to sort of start to build my identity on my own that it kind of came full circle. And I said, oh, even though I may not always feel like I'm, you know, uh, an outsider, increasingly I started to feel like I didn't quite fit in, and it was a surprising thing because growing up in Southern California, I think acceptance was this sort of thing I could take for granted. There were enough Asian and Asian Americans around that it was, as tolerant and as inclusive an environment as there was going to be for someone, like me. And then kind of going out into the world, and especially when I moved to New York for law school, it was a little bit eye-opening. And so uh, I think that, well, one, I think I've strayed very far from your original question, where I'm like, I'm
Well,
not
no, no,
answering
no.
what you
Well,
asked at all.
well, no, but interestingly, talking about how there were Asians, or you grew up with Asians in your community. So did that conflict with what you were seeing in film and television, and really the lack of representation, or the stereotypical uh, uh, displays of what being Asian was supposed to look like?
It did, yeah. um, there was this weird kind of dual reality. There was what I saw in my life, with my family and friends and in the community, going out to eat in Monterey Park or wherever on the weekends, or Torrance, and there's Asians in the world,
By the way,
and
for
most
by,
people
by the
I'm
way, for people who are yeah, for people who don't know Monterey Park, Torrance, there are lots of Asians in those communities. So that's kind of that was your world growing up. So anyway, just giving
yeah,
people a
thanks for
reference.
that. Yeah, I'm just like throwing out names of things. um,
Okay.
yeah. So I had, reality, and then TV reality, the like cultural reality of, and those two things, there was this big disconnect, right? Of like, how come this doesn't match that? Um, and what does that do to you, as you're watching that? Both, I think, both for Asian Americans and for everyone else, to say, well, I know Asians, my dentist is Asian, or whatever, my neighbor is Asian, my classmate is, coworkers. But in these stories we tell ourselves on the sort of biggest platform, they don't figure into the story. And when they do, it's a certain kind of story. Like, what does that do over time in terms of like shaping your perception of sort of, who, what is this country really? So it on one level, and at the same time, you're not seeing it. And I think that has an effect on everyone, not just Asian Americans, in terms of when you close your eyes and think, what is an American? Picture an American. If you're going to picture, like, I don't know, a Benetton ad or a Levi's ad, is this the first face you picture? Like, now, I wouldn't picture my face first. And what does that say? That's it seems like a just like a break from reality in terms of what we're actually seeing on screen.
And do you think that may have been one of the reasons why you didn't think to pursue a career in media as a young person to begin with? I mean, do you think that had there been better representation, you might have just decided, let's bypass law school, medical school, and law school altogether and just go for it because there were examples of people who were doing it?
I think so. I think if I had seen, you know, um, a very clear model or path, I might have been brave enough to take the risk. A risk that you took. You mentioned Connie Chung, and so there was a model, but still, that's a huge breakthrough to be sort of, you know, um, really a trailblazer in a field. And I was very risk averse. Not, I think even before I was a lawyer, I lived kind of trying to not make mistakes, rather than like, as if it's like, how many things can you get correct? It's more like, how many mistakes, how many like incorrect things are you gonna do? And I was always afraid of that. I wanted to minimize the number of things I did wrong rather than take risks and try to do things that might connect with something. Um, and I think that's even true of my writing now, and the way I sort of like, right now I'm not moving around a lot, but usually when I'm on a Zoom, I'm constantly just sort of like moving around because I don't even like the way I'm fitting in the frame. It's just this constant self-consciousness, and same with my talking. It's my wife has like told me I used to do, and she's totally right about this, that she's being kind and helpful. And she's like, there's not I don't want to make it sound like she's criticizing me, but she's like, sometimes when someone asks you a question, you answer everything but the question. I'm like, that is true. And it's like, I don't, I'm good in like the 10th draft. I'm not good in the first draft. And I think there's just this fear, and I'm trying to get back around to what you asked me. For me, there's this, I do think it stems in some way from being Asian American, from having grown up feeling like very tentative, very much feeling like, I don't know, um, how much you accept me, I don't even know how much I accept myself. There's just like this deep uncertainty or feeling like I might just get kicked out of the place at any moment, meaning the room, not like, I don't know what I mean by that.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, there has been this sort of sense of invisibility. I think that irrespective of whether we grew up among a lot of Asians or not, we have just felt in this country at some point or another we have been made to feel invisible or as an outsider. And I think that the media, which is the most powerful arbiter of culture, has not helped the situation. To the contrary, up until recently, um, as your book so brilliantly lays out, Asian people were just kind of in the background. They never had the starring role, and if they did, it was a specific role. It was Kung Fu Man, right? And so, do you think now that you are in the business, do you have a desire to change things? Do you think that you have been able to change things or make an impact in shaping how people perceive Asians in the media?
Hmm. Um, I mean, I hope to someday. I don't think I have gotten there. I hope I hope by writing this book and getting to have conversations with people. I mean, with you here for South by Southwest, obviously is extremely exciting. But over the past year, I've had, you know, dozens of meetings with book clubs and with groups and at universities. I mean, all virtually. So, uh, all in this room, actually. I've traveled the world, um, and um, and that's um, really why I wrote it. To connect with people, to say, here's something that is maybe um, weird and private, from one person's sort of experience and um, consciousness, and putting it in this form and somehow transmitting it, and then all of a sudden people feel like there's a some kind of shared experience. That's an extremely gratifying thing to be having this conversation. On a larger level, I hope I get to make a show and in some ways tell the story on an even bigger platform. I am, developing Interior Chinatown at the moment for Hulu. So we'll see if that actually ends up, becoming a show and then maybe starting more conversations.
How would you assess sort of the state of media for Asian Americans right now?
That's um, B plus.
Because there have
No,
been
I don't
some.
know.
Okay, but there have been some high profile films and television series and actors who have sort of risen, um, I guess, up the ladder, so to speak. Chloe Zhao just won Golden Globe for Best Directing.
Yeah.
I think she's only the second female ever to win that award, and her film won Best Picture. And Parasite uh, won the Oscar for Best Picture. So how would you would still say B plus?
No, I was just kidding.
Oh.
I was stalling so I could. I, I, you brought up, great example. Chloe Zhao winning that award was really amazing, and yet, um, and Minari, putting aside sort of the foreign language controversy in terms of the category, has gotten a lot of attention and acclaim. And the fact that people are saying, I think the fact that there is this, conversation and argument, like, wait, why is this in this category versus another? That, to me, that's a sign of progress. So it's, to me, extremely encouraging. I feel like it's very recent, just in the last 5 years. It feels like there's been just a breakthrough in a way of like, maybe this isn't just the cycle of every 10 years there's an Asian thing, and then we're like 10 years go by, it's like, what happened to that Asian thing? Like, maybe it feels like for a number of reasons there's a real momentum and permanence to this, but it'll take work, right, to sustain it. I don't think there's a inertia or structural, forces that'll keep it going by itself. It's going to take, you know Asian American writers and storytellers and directors and filmmakers to continue to, and journalists to continue to push that forward. But yeah, I think that's what's really, is not contradictory. It's things can be going forward at the same time that we can be experiencing, this kind of huge surge of anti-Asian sentiment at the same time. We have, on the one hand, Asian Americans winning major awards, and on the other hand, we have Asian Americans being victimized. It's all happening at the same time, I guess.
Well, your book came out in the beginning of last year in January 2020 against the backdrop of COVID. And I think we all by now have heard or seen videos of Asian people in this country and even around the world getting attacked. And, as I was thinking about this conversation with you, I was thinking about the characters in your book, and how they were specifically written to really be generic, because that's how the media portrays them. And I was even thinking about so many of the people who've been attacked recently, and how there have been reports of over 3,000 attacks on Asian people, but we know so few of their names. They continue to be sort of identityless. And do you think that that still is the way Asians are just perceived in this country, as somewhat without identity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question, and I think so. I think the answer is, to some degree, yes. I think, um, you know, as we talked about a little bit before, there's actually characters in the book named Old Asian Woman and Old Asian Man, and that's for a reason. I think that, at least for me, there's always been this sense of, if there's a line dividing, like, other, old Asian people seem to be pretty far on the other side, in this country. They just aren't, whether it's a matter of appearance or language or demeanor, but I don't think it's any of those things. I feel like it's driven by deep-rooted perception, of, these are foreigners. This is a foreign face. This is a foreign body, and it's so it is really unsettling, and yet not totally shocking, to see how this is, how they are, these elderly Asian people are the ones being sort of victimized in the greatest number. I think it goes to a lack of, I don't know if it's empathy or just an inability to see them as fully human in the same way that other people are. I mean, it's horrifying. It's hard to even talk about without just sort of like, how do you wrap your head around some of the things we're seeing and hearing about?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really even thought about it much until I started thinking about the conversation I was going to have with you, that I've even talked about these people publicly and referred to them as, the 91 Asian grandfather, or the 80-year-old Asian grandmother. And, these people have lives, these people have histories, these people have families, but somehow we all collectively have, um, been complicit in keeping them invisible. And that makes me really sad. And when I think about everything that's going on, while it's shocking and devastating, Asians have been scapegoated throughout this country's history. From the moment the Asians arrived in the 1800s, but we just aren't introduced to Asian American history in our history textbooks. When were you introduced to Asian American history?
Um, yeah, it's, a little bit by my parents, in terms of family history and personal history, and then a little bit in college through courses and through student groups. Um, and I think that's when I first, was introduced to this concept of the perpetual foreigner. The idea that one, it was surprising to me to realize how early, Asians had been coming, to the United States, and and that just put everything in a totally different perspective. It's one thing when you think, oh, I'm the second generation, but why was I the second generation, and realizing sort of the long history of literal exclusion, right? Literal exclusion on the basis of race. And
The Chinese
and then I
Exclusion
think
Act, the only demographic, I was saying the Chinese Exclusion Act, the only demographic that was ever barred from becoming United citizens. And that executive order that was imposed in the 1800s wasn't repealed until the 1940s, which is astounding to
yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah,
Sorry
it
to
was
interrupt you.
60 some years. No, you did. I'm glad you did. It was 60 some years from, I think, 1882 to 1943, where literally, except for a tiny quota, um, Chinese were barred from entering the United States. And within that, there were, it was basically expanded, I think, in 1924 to basically include any Asians. It was, they were put in a category of aliens ineligible for citizenship. That was sort of the legal category, and then a bunch that by the federal government, and then a bunch of states modeled their laws off of that language, restricting aliens ineligible for citizenship for certain rights, like owning land, owning businesses, um, which is this ultimate kind of circular logic. They're like, oh, you're an alien, therefore you don't have the right. It's from the beginning they were sort of, and so backing up a little bit, there's this timeline of, say Chinese were coming to for the gold rush in the early 1800s, as early as I think the 1830s. By the 1850s, there are riots. There was or the Rock Springs massacre, where dozens of Chinese were killed because there were white workers who were angry that the Chinese were willing to work for less money and their employers were willing to pay them less money. And so by the 1850s, there was already this kind of anti-Asian sentiment. And so then, as you pointed out, by 1882, there's this long exclusionary period where they're just not, where Asians are not allowed to become Americans, literally, right? And so we have this, like, they came, they tried to be part of this country, they were locked out, and then only fairly recently, in 65, after there's a 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act that sort of reopened things in a way, and so you start seeing these waves of immigration, and that timeline with this big hole in the middle is weird, because it essentially kind of, in a way, codified the alienness of Asians. It says you can come when we need you to, and then when we want to kick you out, we're going to kick you out. And I think we're still, for me, still living in kind of the repercussions of that mentality. Yeah, I think.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, throughout history, again, Asians have been scapegoated and suffered suffered from severe discrimination. I mean, you look at the biggest lynching in American history happened in Los Angeles. This is Chinatown, in the 1800s, and then when you look at World War II and the internment of 120,000 people of Japanese descent, so many of whom were American born. It's just it's and then you have the model minority stereotype of Asians, right? It's but they're such hard workers and they keep their heads down and they are achievers. But the moment something happens, like a pandemic, right, or there is geopolitical conflict, we go back to scapegoating them and treating them as perpetual foreigners. And I just, as someone who was born here, I don't know that I will ever see a time when I will feel entirely American, and that I will, in some people's eyes, never be seen as fully American. Do you ever feel that way?
I do. Yeah, I absolutely do. And I think that is, um, it's one thing for me to uh, grapple with that. I live in so many ways like very privileged existence, uh, and um, but when I think about how it will affect people that are more vulnerable economically or physically, it really saddens me, and it it just makes me think, well, how can we ever change it? If it hasn't changed in close to 200 years, will it ever change? I mean, I want to be more hopeful than that. I think a lot of the things that forced these things to the surface was actually my kids getting older, because I sort of realized as they were coming home from school, when they're 4 or 5 years old, they were asking questions like, "What are we?" Because they'd grown up, thinking they're American. What else would they be? Um, and so questions that I sort of thought I had answered for myself, I hadn't really answered. I had just sort of come to some kind of uneasy peace with, like, okay, well, that's how it's going to be. Like, I get it. I know how to navigate. I know how to sort of try to be invisible, try to get by and do well without making waves or thinking too hard about what people think about me. Just I'd found a solution for navigating kind of the trickier questions of my identity. But as a parent, being forced to articulate some of those things all over again, and for someone else, for someone that I don't want to have, that I hope that my kids will, and everyone's kids will have a very different environment. So, and you brought up the model minority myth. I think it's really important, to address, the reality is, I think I was reading, there's a 2018 Pew Research report that showed that Asian Americans had the highest level of poverty in New York City as a percentage of the group. I mean, and that's shocking, to just, even when that there are plenty of Asians that are not doing well, it's sort of shocking. And I think as a group overall nationally, there's the highest income inequality for Asians, within the category. And so this idea that Asians are this kind of homogenous, monolithic, successful group is not only wrong, it's, damaging. And yet it's still a category that we can talk about, because sadly, that's how we're perceived as a group. I mean, if there's one thing that's unifying these attacks, it's that, oh, that's an Asian. Whatever signals Asian, I'm going to attack that person. And the victims have come from all different backgrounds, but for whatever reason, they're lumped together as Asians.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to hear you talk about how your first real exposure to Asian history didn't happen until college. Similar story for me. In fact, my mom is from Taiwan, but growing up, I didn't even know what being Taiwanese even meant. I was just the Chinese kid who was embarrassed of being Chinese because I was so different from everyone else. Do you think, Charles, that introducing Asian American history to kids while they're in school, um, do you think that that will generate empathy? Do you think that that will give um, give us a better understanding of the struggles and the discrimination that Asians have felt throughout this country's history?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I don't know if there's a specific, I mean, I imagine there are efforts to increase that in curricula. Um, but, and to be honest, I'm sort of embarrassed that I had never specifically thought about that. I just, why not? Why not in middle school? Why not a unit on, oh, Asian Americans are part of the history of the United States. Here are some things that Asian Americans have done. I think that would be hugely important. I mean, yeah. now,
Yeah.
now you've got my head spinning.
Well, how does it feel for you, Charles, to be? I mean, this book really is so much about identity, and trying to figure out what your identity even is. So, for you, having written a book like this, I'm sure that you are constantly asked about your own identity. What does that feel like for you as someone who um, has been somewhat, I don't want to say risk averse, but fearful throughout his life about taking risks, especially in this climate when historically there really haven't been um, uh, people or projects or shows for you to look up to and emulate. You're kind of that person now for people.
That's a scary thought. um, it, it, um, yeah, it feels on one level, to be honest, scary to think that, to have actually entered a conversation, that was the whole goal, is to write a book that would start conversations or get people thinking or seeing things in a different way. Um, and, and to actually have done it, you're like, oh, maybe I didn't want that. I liked it better when I could just quietly scribble by myself. And and of course, at the end of the day, that it's not as if I wrote the book to have a literal message, right? I mean, I wrote it because it's fiction, and it's a story that I wanted to tell because it helped, me in telling it and working out these questions for myself. Here I am in my mid 40s, still kind of asking myself the same questions I was asking, 20 years ago or more. And, but of course now I've got all these other roles, right? As husband and a dad and a son, and a member of a community, um, and also as a writer. I mean, I think it's really exciting to think of um, being able to potentially tell a story, with a broader, TV or film platform that reaches even more people. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think, to me, as much as I've focused on, you know, or and rightfully so, focused on being Asian American or Taiwanese American, that's also only one part of my identity. It's not like I walk around all day just going Asian, Asian, Asian. Like, I'm not just walking around thinking about being an Asian. Um, Mostly not. Mostly it's like being a person and an American. So I really am, like, I think so many people trying to figure out how to navigate all of that, and then it gets so much more complicated in this environment we're in right now. um, so yeah, I think I just rambled and I didn't actually.
No,
um,
no, no, no. I think that's really moving because it's true. I, I, I feel like right now, because there is so much attention on these attacks, and the anti-Asian xenophobia that is just has become so pervasive around the world. I think so many of us are finding that we're constantly having to speak out on it, and it's exhausting, but yet we have to, like, we have to do this, and we have to um, condemn hatred. We have to almost proclaim our Americanness, which is getting tiring too, because at one point, can we stop trying to prove that we're American, right?
Absolutely. I think I saw you, I wouldn't want to say almost a year ago, right? It was, it confuses me because I'm pretty sure it was in March. And I feel like that's really when everything started. But you were on, I think you were a guest on The View. Is that right? And you were
Yeah,
already
yeah,
speaking out
yeah.
about it. Yeah, and you were really early and right on about sort of what was going to happen. I don't think you were, it was framed as predictions, but it's weird to watch it now almost a year later and realize, oh, this was not, you know, nothing was being overblown. This was, I mean, if anything, it's sort of exploded more than I think I feared. It's worse than I would have thought, honestly, in terms of the anti-Asian sentiment. So, um, but when you were speaking up about it, it yeah, it means something, and I'm so glad you did that. Um, and of course, this is the moment when people are cutting grass outside my window. I hope it's not too noisy. Um,
It's okay.
we can't.
But what do you
Yeah,
think of this movement, Charles? Because this really has been a moment of inflection for so many of us, and I do feel like there is this movement that has just been galvanized around all of these issues. Really, these issues of identity, speaking out against the hate and the racism. Um, growing up feeling kind of conflicted about your identity. What do you think about what you're seeing now and the kind of evolution of this really vocal and powerful Asian-led movement?
yeah. It's it's inspiring, you know, and I think it feels a little um, daunting, to be honest. I think a lot of that sort of same self doubt about is, you know, and I don't criticize anyone who has an ambivalence about it. I totally understand if there are people who are afraid to say something, who are maybe wondering, well, is it really my place? Is this really? I don't suffer from that personally, or you know, aren't we sort of privileged, depending on who's talking, um, or even there are bigger problems going on right now. So many people are hurting, you know, economically. Um, uh, you know, the struggle for Black Americans. You know, do we really want to be trying to chime in at a time that might feel? I all of that. You know, sort of. I get if somebody's having ambivalence. At the same time, I don't think it has to be. Um, One, it doesn't have to be zero sum, right? I think those struggles are tied together, and I think you know, the solution, if there are solutions, will come from, you know, community building on a local level. That, you know, it's like, what can we do? What can I do? You know, even living where I live, to be a better neighbor, be a better citizen of this place, and so it's really exciting to see people like, for instance, in Oakland, Chinatown, working together, multiracial coalitions working together, to protect people or to increase awareness. I mean, that's it's not a silver lining, because of course the attacks are horrible and the harassment is horrible, but uh, if it is a necessary ingredient to progress, then, you know, it can lead to, um, you know, I think people really starting to have conversations that are difficult but necessary.
Yeah. Charles, before we go, I just wanted to know if you can give us a sense of the things that you're working on. Like, oh. Now I do hear a lawnmower. What can we,
Sorry.
it's okay, it's okay. What can we look forward to from you?
Um, I I don't know. I think I'll continue to write. I've, as I mentioned, I'm lucky enough to be working with Hulu on a potential TV adaptation of the book, which is its own kind of challenge. Um, but I do think, this is a challenge that I really am just feel really lucky to have. It's everything that you and I have been talking about, right? It's how do you tell stories that humanize perspectives that don't normally get that treatment? Boy, it's getting really loud. Um,
It's okay.
and uh, it's that's really exciting. And I'm working on a couple of other projects that are in other various stages of development for film, and I hope to write another book someday. This one took almost 7 years, so hopefully the next one won't take that long. And yeah, I've just really enjoyed being in conversation with you, and I am so grateful that you for all of the work you've done, and your reporting and your advocacy. It's just really a treat and a privilege to get to talk to you.
Well, thank you, Charles. And look, I am so proud that you are out there representing for us and telling our stories. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who have in the Asian community, but outside of the Asian community, who have been so moved by your work. So many of us Asians just like really, really related to that feeling of invisibility that is so deftly felt throughout the pages of this book. So thank you, Charles. We can't wait to see what you have coming up, and it's been a real pleasure.
Thanks. Same.